I never thought a white picket fence and a manicured lawn could feel like a front line, but after 20 years in the Army, I guess I should have known that peace is usually just a temporary ceasefire waiting for someone to get bored. It didn't start with a bang or a midnight raid. It started with the kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up, the kind where you know you're being watched from behind a set of expensive Venetian blinds. I'm a man of simple habits. I like my coffee black, my boots shined, and my garage organized with the kind of precision that would make a drill sergeant weep with joy. But apparently, in the gated community of Silver Oaks, having a personality that isn't in quote, beige in quote, is considered a declaration of war. Her name was Beatrice Vance, the president of our HOA, and a woman who looked like she'd spent the last 30 years sucking on a lemon just to keep her face from ever accidentally showing a sign of warmth. Beatrice had this idea that our neighborhood wasn't an oppos, a place for people to live, but a living museum where she was the head curator, and I was the exhibit that didn't and oppos, fit the theme. I remember the very first time she stopped by, I was just unloading some crates from my move, mostly gear and old lockers from my time in the 10th Mountain Division, and she just stood there on the sidewalk, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it was a holy relic, staring into my open garage with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't say in quote, "Welcome to the neighborhood," in quote, or in quote, "Need a hand with those boxes," in quote. She just pointed a bony finger at my heavy-duty storage racks and said, in quote, "We have standards for exterior-facing aesthetics, Mr. Garrison, and industrial hardware is, well, it's a bit aggressive for a family street. Don and oppos. You think?" End quote. I just leaned against the frame of the garage door, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and told her that if she found steel shells aggressive, she'd have a heart attack if she saw what was actually going on in the rest of the world. And from that second on, the clock started ticking. It began with the letters O. The letters were a work of art in passive-aggressive literature, arriving like clockwork every Tuesday morning. In quote, "Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your garage door was left open for more than 45 minutes on Sunday afternoon," in quote, or in quote, "Please be advised that the American flag on your porch must be replaced if it shows any signs of weathering, as per Section 4, Paragraph B." End quote. I ignored them at first, thinking it was just the hobby of a lonely woman with too much time on her hands. But then the fine started hitting my mailbox. $50 for a trash can left out too. Hours past pickup, $100 for a in quote, non-conforming in quote, door handle I'd installed because the original one was flimsy junk. I filed the appeals, I went to the meetings, and I stood there in those stuffy community rooms while Beatrice looked at me through her spectacles like I was a smudge on her glasses. She cooed and oppos. Quite wipe away, telling me that, in quote, "Unity requires sacrifice," in quote, which is just a fancy way of saying, in quote, "Do what I say or I'll make you bleed," in quote. But then, things took a turn into the dark and the personal, and that into oppos. That's when my old instinct started screaming at me to stop playing nice. I woke up one morning to get my daughter, Lily, to school, and when we stepped out onto the driveway, she gasped and covered her mouth, and I felt that cold, familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Someone had taken a can of industrial adhesive and poured it all over my windshield, then smashed the glass with something heavy, leaving a spiderweb of cracks that shimmered in the morning sun. But it was the tires that really got me. All four of them were slashed, deep, jagged cuts that weren't and oppos. Just a prank, they were a message. Tucked under the wiper blade was a piece of notebook paper with 3 words written in shaky, angry print. End quote. "Leave, or else," end quote. My daughter was shaking, asking me if we were safe, and I remember looking at the empty street, the quiet houses, and realizing that the suburban dream was just a thin coat of paint over something very ugly. I called the local sheriff, a guy named Miller who'd seen it all, and he just shook his head while he took photos of the damage. End quote. "Look, Silas," end quote, he told me, leaning against his cruiser, end quote. "I know it's her, you know it's her, but without a face on a camera, I've got nothing but a piece of paper and some ruined rubber." These HOA types, they're like small-town dictators. They think they're above the law because they own the dirt you're standing on. So keep your eyes open, because bullies don and oppos. Stop until they hit a wall. End quote. That was the moment I stopped being a, end quote, resident, end quote, and started being a commander again. I didn't in oppos. T want to fight, I really didn't in oppos. T, I just wanted to be left alone to grill my steaks and watch the sunset. But if Beatrice wanted to play and quote, search and destroy, and quote, I was more than happy to show her how the pros do it. I spent the next week turning my house into a fortress, but a quiet one, the kind where you dawn into oppos. T see the teeth until you into oppos. Re already in the mouth. I installed high-definition 4K cameras hidden in the eaves, motion-activated floodlights that could blind a deer at 50 paces, and a secondary cloud-based server that meant even if they smashed the house, the footage was already gone, floating in the ether where they couldn't and oppos. T-touch it. I also called my old friend Jax, a man I'd served with for 12 years, a guy who could hear a pin drop in a thunderstorm and who had a way of moving through a room like he was made of smoke. He showed up with a crate of tools and a grin that told me he was bored and looking for a reason to be useful. We spent 2 days rewiring the garage, adding hidden magnetic locks and a silent alarm that would vibrate my phone the second the perimeter was breached. And as we sat on the porch drinking a beer that night, Jax looked at me and said, and quote, you know they're coming back, right? People like that, they get off on the power trip, and you're the only one who ISN into oppos. T bowing down, end quote. The following Tuesday, the end quote, official notice of inspection, end quote, arrived, signed by Beatrice herself, stating that due to, end quote, credible reports of hazardous and prohibited items, end quote, the HOA board had authorized a mandatory safety inspection of my garage to be conducted by their, end quote, enforcement division, end quote. I knew for a fact the HOA had no legal right to enter my private property without a court order, but Beatrice didn't in oppos. T cared about the law. She cared about the optics. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the neighbors. I didn't in oppos. T respond. I just waited. I spent the afternoon in the garage with Jax, cleaning my old service pistols. Not because I wanted to use them, but because there's a certain peace in the ritual of maintenance, a reminder of who you are when the world tries to tell you and oppos. Regis the taxpayer. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across the driveway, when the vibration hit my pocket. My phone screen lit up with the feed from the alley camera, showing a black SUV pulling up to the back of my property. 4 men stepped out, and let me tell you, these guys looked like they bought a, end quote, tactical starter pack, end quote, at a surplus store and didn't in oppos to know how to wear half of it. They had these neon yellow vests with, end quote, HOA security, end quote, printed on the back in big, block letters, cheap plastic badges clipped to their belts, and they were carrying heavy-duty bolt cutters and a pry bar. They wearing in oppos. T-cops, they wearing in oppos. T even licensed security, they were just local thug Beatrice had hired to do her dirty work, likely guys from a neighboring town who didn't in oppos. T mind breaking a few laws for a couple $100 and a sense of unearned authority. I watched them on the monitor as they approached my garage door, whispering to each other like they were SEAL Team 6 instead of a bunch of losers about to commit a felony. End quote. Target is inside. Beatrice said the cash is behind the false wall. End quote. One of them said, and I almost laughed out loud, end quote, cash, end quote. I had some old camping gear and a collection of vintage woodworking tools, but in Beatrice's twisted mind, I was probably running a private militia. I looked at Jax, who was already standing by the internal door, his face completely neutral, the end quote, work mode, end quote, expression I'd seen 1,000 times in the mountains of Afghanistan. I tucked my sidearm into the small of my back, hidden under my flannel shirt, and Jax did the same. We didn't in oppos. T want a shootout, we wanted a confession, and we wanted them to feel exactly what I felt when I saw my daughter's face that morning by the car. The sound of the pry bar biting into the metal of the garage door was a sickening, screeching noise, the sound of a boundary being crossed that you can into oppos. T ever uncross. I waited until I heard the heavy, end quote, clunk, end quote, of the door being forced upward, the rollers groaning against the tracks, and then I stepped out from the shadows of the utility room into the main garage space. The 4 men were silhouetted against the streetlights, looking like shadows in the fog, and for a second, they didn't into oppos. T see us. They were too busy marveling at how, end quote, easy, end quote, it was. One of them even kicked a stack of my storage bins over just for the hell of it. End quote, you guys lost? Or did you just forget how to use a doorbell? End quote. My voice was in oppos. T loud, but it carried that low, gravelly authority that usually makes people stop what they're doing. The leader, a guy with a goatee and a vest 2 sizes too small, jumped about a foot in the air, dropping his bolt cutters with a loud clang on the concrete. He tried to puff out his chest, stepping forward and tapping his plastic badge. Silas Garrison? We're here on behalf of the Silver Oaks Homeowners Association. We have a mandate to seize prohibited items and secure this facility. You're in violation of multiple safety codes, and we're authorized to use force if you interfere. I took a slow step forward, letting the overhead fluorescent lights hit my face, while Jax moved silently to the left, cutting off their exit to the driveway, without them even noticing. Authorized by who? Beatrice Vance? Does she know that impersonating a police officer is a felony? Does she know that breaking and entering with a deadly weapon, which that pry bar certainly is, carries a mandatory minimum sentence in this state? The guy tried to sneer, but I could see the sweat beads forming on his upper lip. We aren't an oppos. T impersonating anyone. We're HOA enforcement. It's in the bylaws you signed. Now move aside. We know you've got unregistered hardware in here, and we're taking it for an oppos, safekeeping an oppos, until the board decides what to do with you. He actually reached out like he was going to shove me, and that was his second mistake of the night. I didn't an oppos. To even have to think about it, my hand came up, caught his wrist in a thumb lock, and I pivoted, using his own momentum to send him face first into the concrete floor. He hit with a dull thud and a groan, and the other 3 froze. They looked at their friend on the ground, then they looked at me, and then they saw Jax stepping out of the shadows with a look in his eyes that suggested he was very, very disappointed in their performance. One of you is going to call Beatrice, I said, my voice is cold as a winter morning. You're going to tell her that the inspection in oppos, is going great and that she needs to come down here right now to sign off on the oppos, seize property, and oppos. And if any of you so much as twitches toward those tools on the floor, my friend here is going to show you why we don an oppos. T like people touching our stuff. They were terrified. The tough guy act evaporated the second they realized they weren't into oppos. T dealing with a panicked suburbanite, but with 2 men who had spent their entire lives dealing with actual threats. Goatee man on the floor was sobbing about a broken nose, and one of the others was already fumbling with his phone, his hand shaking so hard he almost dropped it. 10 minutes later, Beatrice's Cadillac pulled up, and she hopped out like she was arriving at a red carpet event, a smug, triumphant grin on her face that died the absolute second she saw her enforcement team lined up against my tool bench with their hands behind their heads. She started screeching about assault and lawsuits and her face turning a shade of purple. I didn't an oppos. T think was biologically possible, but I just held up my phone and showed her the live feed. I've got you on camera, Beatrice. I've got the audio of your boys saying you sent them. I've got the footage of them breaking the lock. And most importantly, I've got the sheriff on the way, and he's really interested in that in oppos. Leave, or else in oppos. Note you left on my car, because we found the notepad it came from in the back of that SUV. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. She tried to stammer, to find some way to spin it, but the walls were closing in. When Sheriff Miller arrived, he didn't end oppos. To even ask questions, he just started handing out handcuffs like they were party favors. The 4 officers were hauled off for burglary and impersonation, and Beatrice was led away in the back of a cruiser for conspiracy and felony harassment. In the end, the HOA didn't an oppos. T just backed down, they collapsed. When the rest of the neighborhood found out what she'd done, and how much of their dues she'd used to hire those thugs, the entire board was recalled in a week. I filed a civil suit that bled their insurance company dry, walking away with a settlement that paid for my daughter's college, and then some. But the money was an oppos. To the point. The point was the day the new board was sworn in, and I was asked to serve as the safety consultant. I declined, of course, because I've had enough of enforcement for one lifetime, but I did make one suggestion. We replaced Beatrice's beloved in quote, rules of conduct in quote, with a single sign at the entrance of the neighborhood that simply says, in quote, be a good neighbor. We're watching, end quote. I still live in Silver Oaks, and my garage door is open right now as I tell you this. My lawn looks great, my flag is flying, and every once in a while, I see a new resident move in, looking a little nervous about the neighborhood rules. I always walk over, give them a firm handshake, and tell them that as long as they're a decent human being, they've got nothing to worry about, because the only thing we don and oppose, tolerate around here, is a bully. But it makes me wonder how many other, in quote, Beatrices, in quote, are out there right now, hidden behind clipboards and bylaws, thinking they can break a man just because they don and oppose. Like the color of his curtains? Have you ever had to deal with a neighbor who thought they were the law? Or a board that went way too far? Did you fight back? Or did you just pack up and leave? Because from where I'm sitting, sometimes you have to remind people that just because you and oppose, at peace doesn't and oppose, mean you and oppose. Forgotten how to win a war. Let me know your stories in the comments. I want to hear how you handle the, in quote, petty dictators, in quote, in your life and don and oppose. Forget to subscribe if you think justice is best served with a side of military precision.